Thank you.
Well, thank you, Anne, and thank you all for joining us to launch this important body of work that has really grown out of the multi-year commitment that the school has made to understanding the U.S., understanding competitiveness and the trajectory of what's happening in this country, and seeing if we could make our contribution to advance the American agenda. And somewhere along the way in that process, we actually discovered that the policies that we need to set may not be the most important problem that we're facing. This slide shows you the kind of one of the key charts from our U.S. Competitiveness Project work, and it really shows you the sort of strengths and weaknesses of America. And what we discovered is that America is really facing an eroding business environment, and this is underpinning the poor results that our economy has gotten for quite some time now, well before the Great Recession. As we look at those strengths and weaknesses, we find that we still have strengths. Those are things mostly driven by the private sector, if you look at the list. But in that lower left-hand corner, we see the red zone. These are areas where the U.S. is in a disadvantaged position and eroding in its competitiveness, areas like healthcare and corporate tax code and other areas that you will not find surprising. And based on this diagnosis of the U.S., we identified what we call the 8-point plan. Some of you may remember that, which was kind of the 8 things that need to happen in Washington if we are going to move the ball on the critical weaknesses that are holding back our economy. And we published that 8-point plan several years ago. We talked to many, many members of Congress and members of the Senate in Washington who got widespread consensus, as we did with you, our alumni, when we surveyed you on are these the right things to do. But as we were ending our meetings on Capitol Hill, almost every single time as we were walking out of the closed door that we'd been in, we heard from the member, gee, it's going to be hard to get this stuff done. And what we understood, and as we started looking back in history, it turns out actually we've made no progress in getting any of these critical things done. We haven't solved public education, we haven't solved infrastructure, we haven't solved immigration, and on and on and on. And it became clear that the problem was not what to do. The problem was not what policy was the right policy. The problem was politics. We couldn't get anything done in America. And the more we looked, this was not just on economic agenda items, it was also on social agenda items, like I've already mentioned public education, but many, many others. And when we surveyed you, the alumni, and we threw in the opportunity for you to talk about how the political system stacks up in terms of a strength or a weakness for America, you'll see also on this slide the political system came out dead last and eroding the fastest. So this body of work really grew out of this finding that we are facing a really crisis of politics in America. Our government is not functioning and moving the ball in the areas that we need to improve if this country is going to maintain its competitiveness, much less renew it and create more opportunity for citizens. And so this work really tries to take a deep, deep look at politics in America with a fresh new lens. And so let me turn it over to Katherine now to talk a little bit to you about sort of how we approach this.
Thank you, Michael. So I'm so pleased to be here today because I share this passion which Michael is exhibiting for the challenge that we're facing with our political system. And we have used this lens in order to provide not just a diagnosis of what's going wrong, but also a prescription for what we can do about it. So we'll spend the next number of minutes talking about the system itself, and we will end with our recommendations for action. But first I want to set the stage. A key finding, which predates our research actually, and which we built on, but it's absolutely critical, is that Washington, no matter how many times we say it, actually isn't broken. It turns out that when you look at it, Washington is delivering exactly what it's been designed to deliver. The challenge is that when you look deeply, you discover that as shocking as it is, Washington is no longer designed to serve the benefits of the citizens or the public interest. It's now been designed and optimized over time for the benefits of gain-seeking organizations, which are political parties and their industry allies, which together we now call the political industrial complex. The U.S. political system is not a public institution. So many of us are used to thinking of government as sort of constituted on a different plane than our private industries. But when you analyze it, in reality, government and politics is in and of itself a private industry, and a very large one at that. In fact, in our research, we sized the political industrial complex, and at the smallest number, it would be a minimum of $16 billion. This industry is a classic duopoly, and that's critical. In the duopoly, the players advance their own interests instead of the public interest. And what's unique about this industry as compared to almost every other industry is that there's no independent regulation. The actors in the industry are the ones that themselves make the rules of the game. We have been so used to thinking that the rules of our political system were set in the Constitution, but it turns out that so many of the rules that govern the incentives driving day-to-day behavior and legislation are set by the political industrial complex and for their benefit. So we end up with the situation we have today, which is that the actors in the political system are thriving, and yet the American public has simply never been more dissatisfied. And troublingly, there's no accountability for that. There's no accountability because there are only two choices of the consumer. So when the consumer, the customer, the voter shows up at the voting booth in November, all they can do is change control back from one dissatisfactory choice to the other. Now, quickly, before we get into the structure, I want to lay forth the work that we did on outcomes. If you want to understand how any industry is performing, you need to look clearly at what success looks like in that industry. For example, in regular for-profit industries, we'd be looking for profitability and for growth. What should we look for in a healthy political system? It would seem to be that we would all have an immediate answer to this, and yet it turns out that we rarely discuss this and there is not consensus. So as a starting point for our research, we put forth these four outcomes. First of all, a healthy political system has got to deliver practical and effective solutions to important policy challenges and create opportunities for its citizens. And second, it also has to deliver action. So you can't simply be for something and not actually get those policies implemented, passed in legislation and implemented. We see that happening all the time. For example, there was the ACA. During the period between 2011 and 2016, the Congress, the House actually, took 40 votes to repeal the ACA. And yet they were never going to be signed into law with President Obama. So that passes for accomplishment, that type of action passes for accomplishment in Washington, D.C., but what we really need is action that gets implemented. Third, you need your legislation to have the ability to generate broad-based buy-in over time. And finally, you should respect, all legislation needs to respect our Constitution and the rights of citizens. These are the outcomes that a healthy political system would deliver, and troublingly, our system is currently delivering absolutely none of them. Let's go quickly to this next chart, and this illustrates quantitatively and over time the lack of these outcomes. What this chart shows you is the vote totals for landmark legislation over time, beginning with the Social Security Act in 1935 and ending with the Dodd-Frank Act in 2010. You can see that the first 5 sets of votes on landmark legislation show that they generated bipartisan support from Republicans and Democrats. And yet when we passed the Affordable Care Act in 2010 and the Dodd-Frank Act in 2010, they were basically passed by Democrats alone. In fact, the Affordable Care Act received not a single non-Democratic vote. This means that we are not delivering the outcomes that are necessary. And the question becomes, why is that? And we want to ask that question and answer it in a way that leads to not interesting commentary on the situation, but rather action. So I'll turn it over to Michael to answer the why question and then come back for the action discussion.
Well, thank you, Katherine. So when we approached this question of what's wrong with politics, it became fairly clear to us early on that it was not a legislative, law problem or a constitutional problem. It was really a competition problem, with the competition having been set and defined by the actors in the system. And so, of course, this is something that those of us who study industries think about all the time. What drives competition? What determines the outcomes you see in an industry? Is it profitable, unprofitable, growing, shrinking? And so we took that lens of competition and industry structure, and tried to really apply it to this very unusual, very funky industry. And frankly, I've been groaning under the effort of trying to figure this out, because it's very complicated, very intricate, lots of special rules that nobody knows about. Not a single one of you knows about some of this stuff that goes on. And we tried to kind of get a handle on all that. And of course, the framework we used is a familiar one to many of you. It's the so-called Five Forces framework, which is the way we look at industries in every other part of the economy. And so when you apply the Five Forces framework to this industry, it starts to show you some very interesting things that, again, most of us probably haven't thought about. So this chart just shows you the five forces. In this industry, the buyer actually, we really need to see the buyer as two separate levels of buyers. One is, of course, is the voter, the citizen, but there's a channel by which the parties reach those citizens. The media is part of that, and the social media are part of that. And those channels have actually been evolving in some interesting ways. We also have suppliers. To run a campaign and to govern, you need a lot of talent, you need technology, you need voter data. There's a very large lobbying business that's a supplier. We have think tanks that are coming up with the ideas. And so that's the supplier side. Of course, in every industry, you're interested in the threat of entry. How hard is it to get in? And here, of course, what we all know is there's not really been a successful major new party since 1860 in this country. There's been a few little very minor parties that came up 100 years ago, but this barrier to entry issue is a central issue in political competition. The parties don't face real new competition, and that's true not just for a whole new party, but also for even what we call a substitute, in this case running as an independent, running outside of the party. That's hard too. And in fact, it's so hard that in the recent presidential election, Mayor Bloomberg gave up. He said, I can't run outside the party. And he wasn't willing to run inside the party. And this is something we may want to come back to later on in the Q&A. And then, of course, there's the nature of the rivalry. How do the actors compete? And in this case, it's a duopoly. And a duopoly is a strange and interesting beast, because when you have two dominant competitors, and really no other competitors, the way you want to think about competition is you don't want to go head-to-head. You don't want to, compete for the same voters. You don't want to all try to reach the same middle. In fact, what you want to do is separate. You want to distinguish and differentiate yourself. You want to separate your voters. And that's what the parties have done. If you think about the customers they're really serving, customers in politics are segmented. There's the average voter. There's the non-voter, and unfortunately there's a lot of non-voters, and of course they don't have much clout in the system. 40% in the last presidential election really took themselves out of having any influence whatsoever on the system. But there's some other segments that actually turn out to be critical to understand. One is the partisan primary voters. The partisan primary voters are the people that actually decide who's going to get on the general election ballot. And who are these partisan primary voters? Well, first of all, they're a very small proportion of voters. So roughly 30%, 28%, it depends on the year and on the election. But those small number of voters actually determine who's going to be on the general election ballot for both parties. They are a critical target customer for the parties. So are special interests, people that really are fundamentally driven by one or a very small number of issues, whether it's labor issues or whatever the issue are. Special interests are really dedicated and committed to pushing their issue, and they are a very critical target customer. And then there's donors. In this industry, there are really two currencies. There's votes. And there's money. And this industry burns a lot of money. As Katherine said, it's at least $16 billion per election cycle. It's probably double that because there's so much stuff that is not well actually disclosed. And so donors are important. And there's a lot of overlap between the partisan primary voters, the special interests, and the donors. And it turns out that those three customers are who the party is really trying to serve. That is their core customer. Those are the customers that have clout. Those are the customers that they listen to. Those are the customers they try to deliver value to. But what happens is that leaves out everybody else, which is probably the significant majority of citizens. The average voter has very little influence in determining what bills get passed and what parties actually do. That is a fundamental manifestation of how duopolies compete. And that has been able to be sustained for many years now because there's almost insurmountable barriers to entry. If you separated the voters and served the fringe and didn't serve the middle in a normal industry, you'd have a new party overnight that would say, look at this, I could serve the majority of citizens and I'm going to take over. Well, in this industry, that doesn't happen. The barriers to entry are enormously high, and we talk a lot about what they are in our report. As a result, this division of citizens and this divisive competition has sustained itself now for quite a long time and shows no signs of ending. And of course, that kind of competition is not trying to serve the public interest. It's trying to serve the interest of these key target voters, which we've talked about. Now, that leads to a very uncomfortable and, frankly, tragic competition that's going on in American politics. As I said, you see on this chart, the first bullet says, we compete by dividing voters, not bringing voters together, not finding common ground, not necessarily even getting things done. But these parties compete by serving and dividing voters and focusing on serving their voters. The left or the right. There are average voters in the middle that might move back and forth a little bit incrementally, but the fundamental problem here is that we're competing on division and serving partisan interests, not on serving the public interest. The competition is heavily driven by ideology. That's what partisans care about. That's what special interests believe in. Ideology is never a solution. It's simplistic. Big government, small government is not the issue. It's complicated. There's a lot of nuances of what parts of government should do what and how big should they be, and that's not ideology. Ideology gets you nowhere. But ideology creates that division. In our competition today, voters are being divided. We citizens are being divided, and we're being told that other citizens are the problem. They're evil. They're bad. They're ruining our country. That's the kind of competition that we have gotten ourselves stuck in. We see no compromise or very little compromise in this system. It's viewed as failure. The key voter, the key target customers for the parties don't want compromise. They believe in their issue, their perspective. That's what they want. The parties are very reluctant to compromise and not deliver on that. But although there's this fierce competition that I've just described, the parties also work together. And they work together over a long period of time to set a whole bunch of rules. election rules, the way governing rules, the way the House and Senate are run, financing rules in terms of how much money you can give to a party candidate versus an independent candidate. There's a whole set of rules that have made the industry more attractive for the duopoly, raised the barriers to entry in many cases, and made it, even more impossible for our political system to serve the public interest, and also for really new competition that really wants to solve problems and get things done to really find a way to get in. Coming out of our understanding here of this competition that we've been working on now for some time, and there's lots of data on this. The report is full of data on this, but you come out of this with really three horrifying realizations. The first horrifying realization is actually the way our political system works now, the parties don't want to solve problems. Because if they solve problems, that means they have to compromise. That means they have to find that common ground. It means they have to deal with the nuance, and that just disappoints their core base, their core customer. And they would actually rather keep the issue alive. As long as immigration is a big issue, then lots of people are going to keep, being interested in the party and supporting the party. But if they actually saw we had a solution for integration, wow, all those people would go away and live a normal life again. And so incentive not to solve problems. What a catastrophe for this country that our political leaders are not in business actually to move things along and to get things done and to really solve problems. And there's copious evidence of that in all the data we have on how much legislation actually gets passed and how much bipartisanship is in existence today. As Katherine said earlier, there's no accountability for results. First of all, there's no new entrant at the door waiting to come in. It's virtually impossible historically for new entrants to come in. It's critical with that issue get taken on if we want to change the system going forward. And then finally, I think it's hopefully clear from what I've already said that this will not correct itself because the competitive forces that in most industries keep kind of bringing competition back to the customer and the public interest, those have been eliminated or nullified. The high barriers to entry, the fact that the customer really only has these two polar choices. So if you want to go from the left to the right, you're making a huge jump. I mean, there's not a whole lot of choices here, and there's really it's really hard for the customer to actually rebel against this industry and force the industry to change its stripes. So we're stuck with a political competition that is failing our country. It has become the number one problem in our view because we're stuck. We're stuck as a country. We're not moving ahead. Not only are we stuck, we're tearing each other apart. Americans are fighting Americans every single day. And that's not the way that this country was formed. That's not the philosophy on which we exist as a nation, and that's not good for progress. So with that, the real problem then is what do we do about it? Just before we get there, just one manifestation of this competition is there's virtually no moderates anymore. In either party, there's a tiny bit more Democrat moderates than Republican moderates, but if you look back in history, there was a lot more Republican moderates. Today, we have no moderates. We've hollowed out moderates. Therefore, that just amplifies this partisanship that we see, this lack of collaboration, this unwillingness to compromise. So what do we do about it? Well, let's turn to that very critical question next.
Thank you. So I think it's clear to many of us after we listen to what Michael has to say about the structure that this system is not going to be self-correcting. It is a complex, multifaceted system which has existed for many years and has been continually reinforced and strengthened over time. So what we need is an overall reform strategy. When you see the complexity of the system, you know there is not going to be one step, one constitutional amendment, one fabulous, throw the bums out term limits effort that would actually change the day-to-day incentives and the rules of the game such that we would observe different outcomes coming out of Washington, D.C. and our state legislatures. It's got to be a strategy. And key also is that good candidates will not be enough. That, so far, is the strategy that most of us use, which is we're looking for the next election. We're looking for the next great candidate. We pin our hopes on this one or that one. We saw it in the 2016 election where the country elected what they thought would be an outsider, Donald Trump, which I'm sure we'll get to in the Q&A as well, thinking that that could change things, and yet we see the same lack of ability to solve our nation's problems. So what should we do? Let's move to the next slide. This is a simple slide, but it's critical to understand that we used our analysis to basically look at the suite of election and governing reforms that have already been proposed and that in many cases have significant support from the reform community around the country, and determine where should we invest, where should we recommend that people like you watching today invest your time. And we decided it has to be only reforms and innovations that are at an intersection of powerful and achievable. What we mean by this: the reform has got to be powerful, meaning it has to have leverage against a root cause, against the forces that we saw in the 5 forces in analysis, because if it's not leveraging there, then it's just a nice idea. The second, and for example, I'll say term limits is one of those. That's a nice idea that doesn't get at root cause because you won't change the incentives. You'll just get a new face playing the exact same game. Now, on the other side, we've got to have the reforms be achievable. And what we mean by this is in our lifetimes, basically. So, for example, the last constitutional amendment that we got passed in our country was over 20 years ago, and it took over 200 years to ratify that constitutional amendment. So as much as some people spend a lot of time hoping for constitutional amendments to address what they feel are bad incentives in our system, such as an electoral college or certain things on campaign finance reform, it's unlikely that that's going to be achievable in our lifetimes and not at this intersection of powerful and achievable, which is what we're going after. Fortunately, there are a set of reforms at this intersection. Now, I should let you know, there are no reforms at the intersection of powerful, achievable, and easy. So we've got powerful and achievable. Let's look at those. Because of the interest of time, I'm going to take you through the overall pillars of our strategy, and then I'll highlight a couple reforms that I'll go into in more detail. First of all, our strategy to reform politics has 4 pillars. We have to address all of them. And our strategy will be more powerful the more we address each one. First of all, we've got to reform the election process itself, and also the day-to-day governing process, which Michael referred to, which are the overly partisan rules by which the House and the Senate functions. We've got to work on money in politics, and we have to open up near-term competition. Let me talk about a couple in the first part, which is to restructure the election process. First of all, so many of you are familiar with the challenge of gerrymandering and what that's doing to distort our representation. That needs to be fixed, so I won't spend more time on that. 2 reforms that together go very powerfully at root cause are nonpartisan primaries and ranked choice voting. In nonpartisan primaries, we would get rid of the challenge, the problem we have with primaries pushing people to the right and the left, pushing our elected officials to the right and the left. What nonpartisan primaries are is to move away from having 2 ballots where you go in and you take the Republican ballot or Democrat ballot. All the candidates appear on 1 ballot in the primary, and then the top, we recommend top 4 vote getters advance to the general election. The second reform that we're recommending is that at the general election, you would have ranked choice voting with instant runoff. Here's how that works. When you go to the general election after your nonpartisan primary, you have 4 candidates to choose from. You rank them 1, 2, 3, 4 in order of preference. Then when the votes are automatically counted, a candidate can win with over 50% at the first counting, but if no candidate has generated support from a majority of voters, then the last place candidate is dropped, and the votes for that candidate are automatically reallocated to those voters' second choice. By the time the computer completes this, which is pretty instantaneous, you have selected in that election a candidate with the broadest support among the most number of voters. This could, combined with nonpartisan primaries, could be very powerful in changing the incentives that these candidates answer to when they're legislating, because I want to quickly talk about how partisan primaries affect the behavior when you're legislating. It's not just we say these things to get elected. It's once the candidate is elected and has to consider an actual solution, a bipartisan compromise, the operative question that they must ask in most cases is not, is this the right policy for the country? Is this what my constituents would benefit from? They have to ask themselves, can I make it back through my partisan primary if I vote for this? And if the answer is no, it doesn't matter most times what they say or think behind closed doors, because their rational incentives are not to support that. So if we add those three reforms together, we restructure the governing process, which we could talk about in Q&A, but I won't go into now, and we also work on money and politics. This can be very powerful. Quickly on money and politics, it's not the whole game. In fact, it's not even the single most powerful thing that we could do. If you don't change the rest of the structure, it doesn't matter how much we're paying. You could pay much less, but if these are still the incentives, even if they cost 1/10 as what they cost now, people will still act in the same way. But so the real answer for money in politics is over time to alter the return on investment that those who put money into politics for special interest reasons are now getting. Basically, if you change the incentives and the politicians are not responding to the money will go out of politics, and that's the right order to do it. In the meantime, so those first three pillars of our strategy will take time, a decade, 2 decades. Having said that, there are things that we can do in the near term. As soon as 2018, we can open up near-term competition. One particularly promising strategy is a Senate fulcrum strategy, and the idea behind this is without changing any rules of how the game is played, the country could elect, let's say 3 to 5, independent, problem-solving, solutions-oriented U.S. senators, not beholden to either side of the duopoly. And these U.S. senators could deny either party a majority in the U.S. Senate such that they become the most powerful centrist swing coalition, and could then work with either party to bring progress forward on many of the key issues that Michael and the U.S. Competitiveness Project have identified and of which we're all well aware. The Senate fulcrum strategy is quite powerful. It's available to us in 2018, along with supporting other independents and those running separate from the duopoly. So before we move to Q&A, I'd like to just close pointing out again that over time, our political system was a foundation, if not the foundation, of the United States' success. When I saw originally the political system in the bottom left-hand corner of the U.S. competitiveness as the weakest link, it was shocking, because we know that after World War II, if you think about where America was in the world, that is not where our political system would have figured on an assessment of U.S. strengths and weaknesses. But today, it stands in the way of progress on every issue. And this happened over time by the people we elected who are making the rules. So now we have an opportunity to change it by getting engaged and by also engaging in political philanthropy. Finally, before the Q&A, I'll leave you with one quote which Michael and I like. This is from John Adams, one of our founding fathers. "There's nothing which I dread so much as a division of the Republic into two great parties, each arranged under its leader in concerting measures in opposition to each other." That is precisely where we've ended up. And this is now our opportunity to reinvigorate our democracy by changing the rules of the game such that we move away from this current system towards healthy competition that delivers the outcomes we need. Thank you. And Anne, we'd like to take some questions.
Terrific. Well, thank you both. And listeners, to submit a question, please click on the Q&A symbol on the top right of your screen to open the Q&A box and then type in the question. So let's start here. Can the U.S. political system change, or is it inevitable that the system will be hostage to special interests?
Okay, completely not inevitable. Let's talk about what we just said for these reforms. There's a set of reforms, among them the Senate Fulcrum Strategy, which are available to us as citizens already in the next election that we vote in. And there is progress being made on every one of the reforms that I mentioned. So if you take nonpartisan primaries, those have already been instituted in Washington State and in California. If you take ranked choice voting, that was instituted last November in Maine. How does that happen? It's interesting. The politicians, the members of this political industrial complex have been cooperating well together to, make the rules over time, as we've discussed. But we have available to us 3 opportunities to change those rules. First is citizens' referendums, and this is definitely where you're going to see the earliest signs of progress. In 27 of our 50 states, there is some version of an opportunity for citizens to vote on ballot measures, and then they directly change the rules of the game without asking those who benefit from them to do it. And that's how Maine got ranked choice voting, and that's how Washington and California got nonpartisan primaries and nonpartisan redistricting. Second, there's legislation. We can go to the courts for the right issue. This very promising case, which could be a death knell for partisan political gerrymandering. And the Supreme Court is going to hear that argument on October 3rd and should rule in time to affect the 2018 elections. The third way that we can affect change is by going to our state legislators and getting them to change the rules, because the rules of politics are basically set by states and state constitutions. So in those 27 states that don't have citizens' referendum, that is indeed going to be harder. But I promise you that in the end, the voters are still the boss. And if you have 27 states, let's say, that enacted these reforms through citizens' referendums, the other states with that kind of momentum will no longer deny that kind of democracy to their voters, because there will be so much pressure to make it happen. So again, nothing at the intersection of powerful, achievable, and easy, but very good things at the intersection of powerful and achievable if we get engaged in that effort.
Thank you, Katherine. We have a number of questions coming in about the media, about how we can get them on board for change, what their interests are. So what trends are you seeing in the media and technology industries that serve the political industry?
Well, that's a very important piece of the overall industry structural evolution that I didn't cover, but we discuss substantially in the actual report. What's happened is that there's some channels to reach voters, like sort of, let's call it direct voter contact, house to house, knocking on doors, having, Republican coffees and, whatever. Those things are controlled by the parties. They've always been controlled by the parties. There's political advertising. That's controlled by the parties. But historically, critical to the channels of distribution were the media. The media was the way that information got to the voters, and the media were independent. And the media acted independent, and they treasured being independent. And, I remember as a very, very young boy, seeing Walter Cronkite opining about, what we should do in America, on the network. What's happened over time for a variety of reasons is the media has now aligned with the duopoly. So we now have the media tend to be pivoting either to the left or to the right, and their programming then is not the independent, weighing and balancing, between the two sides. It's really telling the story and of one side or the other. And again, we've all experienced that. There's a lot of shows now that do that. And so the media have now become megaphones for amplifying partisanship rather than the voice of helping citizens sort through the complexities of real solutions and why the ideology makes no sense and all the things like that we love the media to do. So media have actually been making this worse. The question is, how can the media evolve and make it better? There's still independent media out there. Hopefully there'll be more. Hopefully this work and other dialogue, I think, will start to have the media start questioning their strategy. Right now it's more of a reality TV show. He said, she said, oh, last night we heard that, oh, today they said this. And that's good television in terms of viewership, but unfortunately it's really undermining our system. So the media is a big player, and we don't put forth a strategy for the media in the report, but we will do our best to get there as soon as we can.
Thank you. So speaking about the two parties and the back and forth, would you conclude that all two-party or non-multi-party systems will not perform well for its citizens? And how does a third party break through and succeed?
So here's key. We are not advocating for a third party or a multi-party system. What we're advocating for is that the consumer, the citizen, the voter, has choices. We suspect that based on our Constitution, over time, our country will likely almost always have two major parties at any given time. What we want to see change is not the number of parties, but whether those parties feel that they could potentially be replaced by a new competitor that would do a better job at meeting the public interests and delivering solutions and opportunities for the citizens. So it's not that having three would make it better. It's that having the parties feel accountable for delivering, and that if they don't, they could then be replaced.
So I think just to build on that, so we need to bring down the barriers to entry. And if we can do that, and if the voters are unhappy with a given party, a new party, or even independents could come and get established as a significant voter bloc, then that would then create that discipline and that competition shifting pressure that we really don't have today. So, I want to be clear. I mean, we're Harvard Business School. We're not against parties. We're not against Democrats. We're not against Republicans. This work is about politics, but it's not political. The way we come at this is that our country is failing to move ahead. We're not solving our most fundamental problems. There is no doubt whatsoever about that. And the root cause of that is not that we can't agree on what the problems are or on reasonable solutions that the experts and consensus builders can agree on. The problem is the political system. So we have to fix competition. Hopefully Republicans will be part of a different kind of competition. Democrats will be part of a different kind of competition. But that's the fundamental purpose of this work. And we are very anxious that we don't let this get into a finger-pointing exercise. Oh, it's the Republicans. Oh, it's the Democrats. And that's what we've fallen into today. We tend to blame the other party for whatever we don't like, and rather than actually questioning whether both parties are competing in a way that actually is in our interest. And it's that competing in a different way that this work tries to take a crack at. As Katherine says, it's not easy to change that, but I think we're at a point now where hopefully the awareness and the stakes are getting sufficiently high that many citizens will start to look at this differently. And also, we've tried the experiment of electing a real outsider who's supposed to be able to get things done, President of the United States, and guess what? Don't hold your breath. Nothing's happening. So that didn't change the system. And to change it, we're going to have to deal with these underlying issues.
So let's build on that, actually. And Katherine, you also brought up Trump, and certainly there are a number of questions that came in advance of the webinar and during the webinar about Trump. Is this the new normal? What is there to be said about Trump?
So Trump, he's not the new normal. He will do what Trump is going to do, and neither Mike nor I will be able to predict that. What is normal before Trump and will be normal after Trump is the system that we've described today, with these incentives, with this structure, with this unhealthy competition. And the election of Donald Trump actually had virtually no impact on the underlying system and the rules of that game that are played. So I don't know what he's going to do from day to day, and we don't know what he's going to do from yesterday to today. But what we do know is that unless we intervene in the functioning and the rules of the game, we're not going to get much done in this administration, and we're not going to get much done in the next administration. Now, I will say, don't be confused. We can, as a country, get things done in crisis. In crisis, we come together, we pass things. But we are not solving the issues of the 8-point plan. We're not solving the long-term issues, and that Trump makes no difference in.
Thank you. If our political crisis is not self-correcting, then how bad can conditions get, and how can business best prepare itself?
Well, thank you for that question. I would say that, it's pretty bad. So can it get worse? I mean, we literally haven't passed any significant rules on almost anything significant that really matters to the economic agenda or some of our core social issues like public education. I mean, we all know that public education is the big kahuna. It's what creates opportunity. It's what explains inequality. It's what explains who doesn't have a job. And yet we're still wrangling decade after decade after decade on public education. We still, the people that don't like charter schools call the people who are supporting charter schools evil, and they picket and they yell epitaphs at them. That's America today. We once had the best public education system in the world. Now, every year or every 2 or 3 years when the PISA rankings come out and we rank to other countries, we're lower and lower and lower and lower. And that's true on many of our social issues. So it's pretty bad, and it's hard to see how much worse it could get than that. Making no progress it's hard to be worse than making no progress. I guess we could make negative progress, but even that is hard to imagine being worse than it is today. Okay, so it's pretty bad. But I think the business community of the players that could make a material difference is critical. And one of the things we hope is that our alumni, you, and others in business who understand industries and understand competition and understand how to think about this stuff will start to then see this political competition now in a different way. It won't be, oh my God, rolling our eyes, this is nuts. It'll be, oh yeah, this is a great game. It works for them. It doesn't work for us, and we can start doing. Now, as business leaders and others in business look at this, I think the one truth we have to say, and that is too many companies have either completely opted out of politics because they see no benefit in it because it's so ugly, but even more difficult is that many companies have started to learn how the game is actually played in politics. And that game is the game of special interest. Too many companies have become special interest. Too many companies have advocated their particular little goodie, whatever it is, their particular regulatory this or tax loophole that, and business has actually contributed to making this worse. We wouldn't have a convoluted tax system if it weren't for business. Business has put that in place through all the lobbying over the years. There's a lot of research on the ROI of lobbying, and as you can probably guess, in this system, the ROI of lobbying is quite high. That's the consistent finding. So it's paid business to, advocate their special interests, but that act is undermining the fundamental nature of our political competition and our ability to get things done. So I hope that we in business and all of us connected to the school can become the force in the other direction, and we have to figure out a way to take positive leadership in getting some of these structural changes done that we need to get done, and we need to get our organizations not aiding and abetting the current duopoly competition, but actually kind of being a break against it. I think that's very possible. Our Harvard MBA students that are on the campus right now are phenomenally focused and passionate about this issue. So are all young people. They're freaked out. So with any luck, the business community, our young business leaders in particular who haven't gotten used to the system the way it is, will be leaders in helping us move this agenda forward.
Great. This political situation has been visible for many years with increasing dysfunction. How do we reframe the issues and challenges so that all parties reach consensus and rise to a new level of collaboration?
That's precisely what our intention is with this research analysis and report, which is to reframe the issue so that we have a rubric, a framework with which we can understand the rational actions that the people playing this game in the political industrial complex are currently taking, and then use that same framework to determine what interventions, innovations, reforms, if we implemented them, would address that root cause such that the incentives for rational action would rationally be different. And that's how you're going to make it happen. And I hope that we have been able, even in this short time, to give a sense of how actually doable that mountain is to climb.
Yeah, I would add one more point to that, which I think Katherine touched on earlier in the presentation, but I just want to emphasize, and that is I think we have to understand politics differently in a very important way, and that is we have to understand what we want our political system to deliver. And I think too many Americans have been educated by the parties to believe that success in the political system is blocking those guys from what they want. Or really preserving our ideological commitment to low taxes, or never even imagining a tax reform policy that actually lowered tax for business because business is greedy and evil, which has stuck us on corporate tax reform now for 20 years. We've got to get people thinking, understanding that is bad for America. That's not what we want politics to do. We want politics to actually tee up solutions. We want politics to get away from ideology, to realize that there's always common ground. America always found common ground, and compromise was how we got universal public education done and all the other great things we got done in this country. And hopefully if people can start to really reflect on the question of what do we really need from our government, and what do we really need this political process to do? And if we think about that honestly and openly and not get sucked into the way it's been positioned by the actors as what success is, then I think we have a real opportunity to that will accelerate the other changes we hope we've been talking about.
And let me quickly add an example onto that, a real-life example. I used to be really involved in partisan politics before I realized that this was truly the challenge that we were facing. And so I had a private meeting with a relatively prominent U.S. senator, and I was so excited to talk about what policies this particular senator was moving forward and what were the chances for success, et cetera. And in the private meeting, we sat down, and I didn't get to say anything. Immediately, the conversation from the senator was, let me tell you what I'm doing to elect more Democrats, that was the side I was playing at that time, to the Senate. Let me tell you what I'm doing to block this legislation from the other side. There was absolutely nothing about solutions for American people. And when I wanted to move the conversation away from anything other than how are we going to win more seats than the other side, it wasn't a conversation that the senator was familiar with having.
Very interesting. Well, let's close with this final question and then allow you time to share some final takeaways. So you had a really great slide 13. I know you had talked about responsibility as citizens, have some ideas. What can we, as alumni and community members, what can we do to help? Many of us are not politicians. So what are your recommendations?
Well, I think, we laid out a strategy for reform. I think, the first order thing we want everybody to understand is, okay, what are the pillars that we need to affect if we're going to actually change the system? We have a whole lot of specific recommendations here that are detailed in the report. We have ways of reaching out to the organizations that are involved in all these reforms. They exist. Luckily, we do have a substantial political reform movement. It falls below the radar for most of our HBS grads, but it's there and it's alive, so I think there's some vehicles already for people to get involved in a variety of ways with various organizations on this whole portfolio of different reforms, and we'd like to see our graduates and the listeners here participate in that. We'd also like them to take a really, really hard and brutally honest look at what their company is doing in engaging with government and engaging with politics, and make sure that what they're doing is actually moving this competition in the right direction, rather than just reinforcing this game that the parties have created, by which they're doing great, by which the money keeps rising and the actors in the system, are very busy, and the parties delivering great value to the special interest in terms of their lobbying spending, and the partisan primary voters are rabidly, excited about the party that they're part of, and we've got to change what is defined as success. And I think we in business ought to start at home, with our own companies and how we're behaving, and that will make a difference.
For our final thoughts, I'd like to just follow up a little on what you said. You can think of the action part of our report as serving in some ways as a venture capital study of the industry that is political reform and innovation startups. So most of the organizations that are out there have not reached a huge critical mass such that all of you would know of them, but many of them have quite phenomenal, impressive strategies that get at root cause in these achievable reform areas. So this is an opportunity to download the report to look at those areas for investment and ask the question, what should I invest in this particular startup? Should I invest my time, my money, my communication to tell everybody else to co-invest with me? Because it is critical mass into these startups in this nascent industry that is going to be able to move the needle on the reforms we talked about. And I would close by mentioning, and this is particularly appropriate for, Harvard Business School, we are clear as a country that innovation is absolutely critical and foundational for the success that we have in the business community and for growing our economy and our jobs. And it's what Silicon Valley is all about, and any one of your businesses, I'm sure, is deeply concerned about innovation. Why would we think that we wouldn't need the same innovation over time in the political system? Why would we think that the status quo of whatever rules we managed to make things work with in the 1940s are the same rules that we should play the game with today? We need innovation in the political system to deal with the challenges that the world and the country are putting before us today, and to fight back against the bias that's been created in that system by these gain-seeking organizations playing that game over all these years. So let's come together, invest in these organizations, deliver innovation into the political system, and see the kind of outcomes that we described today that so many of us want.
So I just want to add one footnote to what Katherine said, and that is many of us in the HPS community have been very generous, have given money to many social causes. We've tried to improve schools. We've tried to do a lot of things. And one of the things we find is that, philanthropy is great. But if the real problem in many cases is that our government isn't functioning the right way. And in so many cases, our philanthropy is really solving problems or filling gaps or that government has opened because the schools don't work or the healthcare system is not serving the needs of all the citizens. So I think as we think about philanthropy, we put in our report this phrase called political philanthropy. And we think that investing in the overall health of our political system is just as powerful as any giving towards any other social cause. And in fact, it may be more powerful because most of the money on social issues and even economic issues is going to be spent by government. And if that government is spent unwisely and money is spent unwisely and in a biased way and an ineffective way, then all the, giving that we do is not going to matter. So I think we've got to see this political innovation and this political philanthropy as just as important as what we've all sort of grown up doing in the philanthropy sphere.